Welcome to another ADLC Social Studies presentation. Today we will be looking at the first video of several videos based on the challenges to liberalism. And today we will be looking at First Nations perspectives. Liberal ideology is being challenged constantly by many aspects of society, including Aboriginal collective thought, religious perspectives, extremist perspectives, and environmentalism. To impose liberal values means to force those values upon people or states without their permission or agreement. The imposition or forced acceptance of liberal ideology can occur when nations want to protect their self-interest or they want to promote liberal values for humanitarianism. This led to direct conflict with the views of the First Nations of Canada. As you learned in social studies education, the worldview of many Aboriginal peoples of the world is collectivist in nature. This can be seen in the Aboriginals of Australia, the First Nations people of Canada, and the Ainu people of Japan. People from many cultures, including the Canadian First Nations and Inuit people, see themselves as individuals, but also view themselves as just one component of their communities and the natural world. The worldview includes the belief in collective responsibility and cooperation. Ownership of private property is historically incomprehensible, as the land is not seen as something to be owned, but rather something to be shared and respected. Membership in the larger whole provides Aboriginal people with a sense of identity and meaning. In many ways, Aboriginal collective thought is at odds with the principles of liberalism. Differences in the ideological perspective of Aboriginal people and the Europeans led to conflict, misunderstanding, and mistreatment and abuses. The superiority of the Europeans felt towards Aboriginal peoples led them to attempt to assimilate the Aboriginal peoples into the European perspective. This can be seen in the pictures you're seeing currently on the screen, as these are examples from some of the residential schools that 150,000 First Nations children were taken from their reserves and forced to attend. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 recognized First Nations as distinct people and nations. They had given the First Nations the right to govern themselves and negotiate with the Crown as sovereign nations. Despite the proclamation, many Europeans did not believe this, and did not believe that treaties were being made with anyone because they did not consider the First Nations as sovereign nations. With the introduction of the Indian Act in 1876, First Nations political institutions and forms of government were ignored. Thus, the government used the Indian Act to control First Nations behavior. The Indian Act actively eroded First Nations collective rights through its policies of assimilation. Assimilation is the practice of trying to eliminate the difference between groups by absorbing one into a dominant one. One example of the government's policy of assimilation was the banning of the potlatch. You can read more about this in your Social Studies 30-2 textbook. Liberalism was imposed on the First Nations people. When the first colonists arrived in North America, they imposed their political and economic systems on the Aboriginal people. Land was parceled out and purchased by settlers, with reservation land provided for the First Nations people. Residential schools were established to provide First Nations and Inuit students with the same form of education that all students received, with the idea that this education system would provide them with positive freedoms, including freedoms for equal economic opportunities. This was often not the case, with First Nations not even earning the right to vote until the 1960s. Renowned First Nations leader George Aramis put it best when he said, "With the coming of Europeans, our experience as a people changed. We experienced relationships in which we were made to feel inferior. We were treated as incompetent to make decisions for ourselves. Europeans would treat us in such a way as to make us feel that they knew better than we ourselves what was good for us." This superior view led to many abuses faced by the First Nations people. History has shown Canadians that the imposition of liberal ideology on Aboriginal peoples has affected the First Nations and Métis and Inuit in many ways. As settlers came to Canada, greater efforts were made by the government to impose liberal ideology on Aboriginal peoples. Differences in beliefs and values led to conflicts over land ownership. Government attempts at assimilating First Nations people into mainstream were abusive and destructive, and limited Aboriginal people's freedom for control over their own lives. The legacies of these decisions have led to conflicts between the First Nations and Canadian governments. Examples of these conflicts can be seen in the Oka crisis and the recent Idle No More protests which have swept the country. Today, Aboriginal groups, along with the Canadian government, have been working towards resolving the issues created by assimilations. First Nations rights have been enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, land claims are in the process of being settled, and in 2008 the Canadian government formally apologized to the victims of residential schools. The First Nations perspective and its experience with the imposition of liberalism is just one way that liberalism can be challenged. In future videos we will look at the others.